And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. It's July 27th, very hot, very humid afternoon here in Jersey. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Ruben Chacon, who's the CISO and VP of Technology for CDW. Welcome, Ruben. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much, David, for the invitation. My pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Researching your background, it truly is amazing. You've done so much, and what I love about your background specifically, and we'll talk about, we'll dive a little deeper, is that you have hands-on experience, not just academic experience, but hands-on experience with a lot of different various types of areas within cybersecurity, both on the enterprise, the large enterprise side, as well as the vendor side, the MSSP side, which is, again, it's not trivial. Not a lot of practitioners have done the move back and forth between the kind of the service provider as well as the enterprise. So, Ruben, before we get started, how did you get to such a senior position? Maybe walk us through some of your past experiences. How you started as a young practitioner and so on. What was kind of your first role, and we'll start from there.
Thank you very much, David. And just to start, and you hear this heavy accent because I was born and raised in Mexico City. So I studied engineering degree in Mexico, and it was until 2005 when I came into the US. So English is my second language. So I started my career working for
Ruben,
Siemens. Go ahead.
mine is as well. So it's funny, and everyone has an accent. I could tell you, people from Jersey, depending on where they are in Jersey, have accents. So you're doing great.
Absolutely. So started my career, of course, in Mexico City after graduating in 1992. So I worked for the company Siemens, the German company. So and I work internally in the information systems department. So one of my first assignments was to design the first Ethernet network for the company.
Well,
So all the way from the cabling system to the selection and configuration of the Cisco routers and the network interface cards, etc. Back then, so it was not an easy endeavor. So I did it. So we created the first Ethernet network that I designed and configured for the company, connecting many Mexican locations and then connecting to the US and to Germany as well. It
so
was a
Ruben,
beautiful project.
yeah, and I'll stop you for a second, and I'd like to dive a little deeper, because what people don't realize is that back then they weren't like YouTube how-tos to do those, and manuals were very scarce. So this is the intriguing piece, is that people don't realize how in the early days, you basically had to learn everything hands-on, in design and figure out, I guess, a lot of trial and error. But so how did you do that? How did you manage to take on ownership of such a large project, and basically, but without much help available to you?
Well, and you are absolutely right. Back then there was not the Google or there was not the YouTube to help you do it. So you were relying on your own knowledge, and of course, talking to different vendors and studying yourself. Getting to learn a little bit more of that particular field. So, and just as an anecdote, I can tell you, a few days ago I was, well, not few months ago, I was working with somebody, and I was in my Windows computer, and then, we discovered the computer was not connecting to the network anymore. So I said, perhaps it's an issue. We have to release the IP address and then to renew the IP address. And do we have to reset the computer? No. I went to the CMD, the DOS, right, the black screen,
Yeah, yeah.
and I did IP, release, IP renew. And the guy was with the big eyes saying, "What are you doing?" So exactly what I told you to do. So this is because, of course, that deep knowledge that you get when you actually do those things. You design the network, you configure the routers, you put the email, right. Back then was X25 packets. Today is very easy, right, with Outlook.
Yeah,
But so when you learn all the things from within, so and you know how they work, it's easier to protect them. In the security space, somebody asked me, why do you like security? Why don't you go to networking data center? Well, I've been there. I have done that. And now knowing how they work, I think I can be effective at protecting those technologies. So it's always complicated. Technology continues to evolve very much, but knowing the ins and outs and the bits and bytes the machine learning language, those type of things help to figure it out when something goes wrong. Where do I start to build this again, right? So how do I do those things? So
And
that's a bit
Ruben,
of the background.
so this is really intriguing. So, and you're absolutely correct that having the underlying knowledge of how the systems work really helps in protecting it. Do you find that today's new grads and people that just enter the cybersecurity space lack or don't have that deep understanding is because most of the systems are GUI based, right? And they don't have much hands-on experience like you have or you had, just going in the command line and doing all that extra work. Do you find that and in the systems themselves, like Windows, for example, they protect you from it, right? They're trying to hide all the settings from making like almost like a user friendly, quote unquote, which makes it almost impossible to get to the underlying commands. So do you find that there's kind of a gap in that area?
Well, we might think that as a gap, but you have to understand also the new generations are learning way more than what we learn in the school, right? So they are learning to do things, faster, and sometimes, the breadth of knowledge that they have is just amazing, right? I've been amazed by many, interns and young people in our team, who are really, really good at what they do. And of course, I will decide a little bit more to get to know the cabling, right? The cabling system behind the networks, so they can even grasp more, how to do those things. But on the other hand, they are teaching me many, many different things to me as well. How to multitask, is one of them. So and there are many other things that the new generations are helping me to understand.
Yeah, Ruben, there's things I've read about multitasking that we're like very linear in our minds, and so multitasking we don't do that very well. We actually it's just like a multitasker. We stop and go, so it's not exactly that effective to do that. But you're right, the younger generation are really they're so used to stop and go and doing multiple threads all at once. So tell me, you started that, and then, but your career progressed quite rapidly. And again, kudos to you to, as a young immigrant to the U.S., it's not easy to, we talked about this. I'm talking to, minorities and women that are trying to get into cybersecurity, and even as a new immigrant to the country, it wasn't necessarily as easy. I think that to get exposure and get into senior roles, technical or non-technical. But you progressed very quickly. What was your next role after that when you relocated to the U.S.?
Well, let me tell you first. From Siemens, I moved to Kraft Foods
Mm-hmm.
in Mexico as well, managing the whole infrastructure, including data centers, service desk, etc. So I learned very much there. And then, the company started a selection process, an internal selection process to create the new CISO role for the world. They
Mm-hmm.
already selected that person, and then they were looking for who is going to manage the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. So I was invited to this selection process. There were some colleagues from Argentina, Brazil, and some other countries as well. So I ended up getting the position, and the position was based in Chicago, so in
Mm-hmm.
the corporate building. So I came into Chicago in 2005, started to build the team from scratch, right? I was very clear back then. I told the new CISO, Charlotte Duro, at the time, I said, well, Charlotte, I know nothing about security. So I don't have certifications. I don't have anything like that. I just have the knowledge that I have. And she was happy with it. She said, Ruben, that's what I need. A fresh pair of eyes, very practical. So, and then let's start building this together.
Uh-huh.
So we built it. So I had people in Alaska, in Canada, in the US, and also in almost in every country in Latin America. Is how I learned to manage virtual remote teams. One thing that I discovered is the language and the understanding was not the same. So when we talk about users, everybody had a different understanding of what a user might be, right? So I started, okay, let's start with certifications, just to have the same language, talk about the same thing, because we cannot talk about something and then have different meanings for different people. So we
Mm-hmm.
started with some certifications back then. You can imagine the level of change. I moved from Mexico, right, to the US. It was a new country, new position, new job. new language, right? I was not used
Wow.
to speak English every day. My newborn baby, she was 4 months old, the first one. No instructions into on how to handle her, right? So, and then my wife and I coming in here. So, and on top of it, now I have to study for a certification on security, a field that I didn't know, and that today I can tell you I feel a lot of passion for. But back then was a struggle. But I did it, and my colleagues did it as well. And eventually, we formed a very strong team for the Americas. It was quite an adventure. So, and that's what brought me into the US, basically. In craft, I had many experiences in mergers and acquisitions and integrations, etc. For instance, we acquired Nabisco back then, the large cookie company. So, and integrating the company was not an easy endeavor.
Hmm.
And the same happened with some divestitures. The Post cereal was sold to Nestle back then, and then we integrated Cadbury, right, the chocolate company from the UK, and then we separated the companies into two standalone companies: Kraft Foods, which is now Kraft Heinz, and the parent company Mondelez International, the maker of the Oreo cookies and many other delicious products. So I stayed with Mondelez International, and I continued to learn very much from there. So I made some changes. So I went to the Coca-Cola company for 2 years, came back to Mondelez again, and then I went to Constellation Brands, and now at CDW.
So, super interesting. When you talk about these, the kind of mergers and acquisitions, right? And this is part of what people don't realize that the security professionals do when they acquire a company. Now you acquire the assets of that third party, and now you are responsible for that asset, for that infrastructure. And so, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, Nabisco, like they make cookies, right? What was there to integrate? Like, I mean, you're thinking about it like, okay, they have factories and so on, but from an IT perspective, talk to me about that. What was kind of that project like, or and specifically like just getting a new company on board, and you as a person responsible for that, what are kind of the areas you look for, and maybe maybe a couple of the gotchas that you have to look for when you are joining companies.
So let me start first. Is merging two large companies together with
Okay.
whatever they have. They might have already a very good security posture. They might not. You just don't know, and you have to assess in
Hmm.
many different ways. There are the interview assessment, right, and the soft assessment, and then there are the hard assessments where you put capabilities and tools to actually detect if there is any malware or something bad in that environment. But beyond that, I think one of the very important things to do is you have to know the business and business intentions as well. It's very important. Let me tell you why. So, three examples. One, at Kraft Foods, for instance, we were buying brands. So the company was interested in the Nabisco brand and of course the products, right, that
Hmm.
brought to that brand. And then, of course, the manufacturing locations and the expertise of doing those particular products. But everything else was not that important, right? So there were many duplicate positions in all the many different areas. Then you have to start the process to create some synergies and efficiencies, etc. So, but the brand was important and the products that that company had. Constellation Brands, for instance, there were some acquisitions as well, but the company was more looking at craft beer, for instance, looking for the experience. So
Hmm.
for the management, the experience on those craft beer locations was very important to keep intact. So you cannot mess up with the experience of the consumers.
Hmm.
Now, at CDW, for instance, we look for expertise. So we're not looking for the assets. The assets basically are people. So people who have expertise in certain areas. So we have to maintain the user experience. For instance, if people feel that they work more easily with Google Docs and the G Suite, right? And
Hmm.
we're not using the corporate the G Suite. Now the question is, how can I make that work? Right? Because otherwise, I bring all this new talent into the company with the old technologies or the new technologies that we have, right? And they are just not familiar with it. They don't have the same experience. How do we maintain that experience? So we are buying talent. So you can see companies can buy brands or products. They can buy assets, right? They can buy consumer experience or co-workers experience or expertise.
Hmm.
So that's very, very interesting to see. And depending on those objectives, you figure out, what comes first.
And I'll interject here as well because I want to, even pinpoint that. So aligning the business requirements with kind of the security, overall security in IT is really important. And and I guess that's not being talked about so much because we as security practitioners are typically into the nuts and bolts, right? They're like, okay, the systems, the malware, the endpoints, the network, and so on. But as you mentioned, the underlying reasoning for it all is to figure out what it does the business want and what are the goals, and that needs to be like the number one review when you're looking at a different project. So how do you help customers today align these goals and look at their business requirements, and then allow them or provide that services that you do as a company today? Do you still use the same methodology that you apply to when you were a CISO for working for these large enterprise with your customers?
Well, not really. So
Okay.
methodologies and approaches are changing very quickly.
Okay.
So we need to be more agile. We need to listen more, right? And it's what our experts in the field do, right? So they listen to the company and the customer needs. So what are you trying to achieve? That's the first understanding, more than technology and anything else,
Mhm.
that our people want to hear, right? So what are you trying to achieve? And then once we understand exactly what our customers want, then we are in a position to advise in a more precise uh, manner. So
Mhm.
particularly, because we don't know the business, perhaps we know the industry where they are, but that particular business might have their own particularities, of course. So that's what we're trying to understand. Then second, we know technology, we get it, right? So we get IT is our slogan, right? So we understand that perfectly well. And then we look also to the threats and vulnerabilities and trends that are out there to be able to provide advice to our customers.
And you have expertise as well with dealing with some major crises. And this is an area which is it's almost of an enigma to a lot of people. So they hear that on the news, right? They hear, okay, this company got breached, that company got breached, and now the hundreds of thousands, not millions of records got released, or a company went under because of ransomware and so on. Um, Coming from a practitioner perspective, when you are dealing with these crises, what is kind of the CISO role in all of that, and how do you manage it? What does actually happens when the shit hits the fan, and all of a sudden you realize as a company you're facing a major incident? What is kind of your role, and how do you deal with that today?
So the role basically is to provide certainty to the organization. What needs to be done to recover quickly from that adverse effect, to be resilient. So and you cannot achieve something like that. Number one, if you don't know the business. Number two, if you don't know the people, right, which is within the business, and you have not earned their trust, they have to trust you first of all for you to be effective. Number three, you have to be somewhat prepared, right? We all know that something is going to happen at some point
Hmm.
in the future. So those defending have to be right 100% of the time, but those attacking, they just need to be right just once, right? So the odds are against us. Something will happen at some point, and we need to be ready. And there are so many things that we can do in preparation for that. But anyway, so the things are get to know the business very well, get to know your infrastructure very well, and make sure that you work on trust, yeah, building trust with the key stakeholders in the business, and also have a plan. So who is going to be managing when something like that happens? So I have had situations where, for instance, the CFO, who might or might not know about technology, wants to lead, right? But it's difficult to lead when you don't have a strong knowledge on what needs to happen and the sequence of events that need to happen to successfully recover. So you need to get alignment. When something like this happens, who is the lead? So we don't have contradicting instructions to people. So I think that's important.
Yeah. So again, I recommend that we rewind this. Ruben, we pack so much in this short time, but yeah, basically know your business, create that trust among all different parties, as you mentioned, which I would like to dive a little deeper into that because that's something that is not really, again, not really discussed that much. and then have a plan. So let's dive into this second piece. How do you build that trust, among colleagues as well as people that report to you, and then the business stakeholders? Because typically security is always seen as a hurdle for business, and also as a cost center, right? Because you don't necessarily generate revenue. So how do you make these, the other executives and people within the company that are responsible for the business units know that they can trust you and rely on you when something happens?
So before I get into that point, if you don't mind, David, let me
Yeah.
tell you, you said security is a hurdle, and this came to my mind. I remember working for one of these large companies I've been working for, or have the pleasure and privilege to work for. In one of them, we were in the board of directors meeting, and one person in sales, he said basically, something like that. He said, I feel sometimes that security is like the brakes of my car. It's always trying to stop us. It's just not, we cannot do anything. So, and I agree that in some cases might be the case. We said no too many times, and we should say how to do or how to make something possible, right, instead of saying no at the beginning. But in that occasion, I remember I stopped talking and I started thinking about what he said, and I said, you know what, you are absolutely right. We are the brakes of your car. So tell me this, would you take your family or friends in a car with no brakes? In fact, let me ask you this. If we're competing in a Formula One race, we have the best pilot, we have the best team, we have the best car, we know the track very, very well. Will you go maximum speed with no brakes? Think about it. The brakes are enabling you to go maximum speed. So you need to have those brakes. So that's how I see security. It's an enabler, right? And with those situations, those analogies help to create some trust, because now you're not speaking Chinese. You're speaking something that people can relate to. And that's very important, because if people cannot understand you and you talk about the bits and bytes, firewalls, routers, and who cares about this, right? But when you talk about the business terms, the impact to business, and you speak in a language where everybody can understand what you are saying, you start building trust, because now they know, I know who to go to actually understand what is happening in this space. I don't need to become a cybersecurity specialist to understand. I just need to talk to so and so, because they explain things in a very, very simple terms that I can actually understand. That's a first step, right? And of course, the basic steps that are, follow through, right? So walk the walk, walk the talk. So, accomplish what you said you are going to accomplish. Don't be complacent, right? The complacency is really, really bad. So, and be honest. So when I show a dashboard to my my boss or management of the company, I am not trying to look good. There is no reason to do something like that. So it's not everything green. It might be some yellows, some reds, and we need to have an honest conversation, because otherwise it's trying to try to cover the sun with a finger. It's just impossible,
Mhm.
right? So that's the way you create some trust. There are many, many other things you have to do, of course, but those are kind of the basics.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also interesting that it looks like that companies that take security seriously these days, some of them even use that as a competitive advantage. In terms of creating that trust, not just with the customers, but potentially with their partners as well. Since supply chain is such a major issues these days. In from the planning perspective, if you don't plan, you fail to plan, or you plan to fail, right? So how do you do that when there are, first of all, there's so many moving parts, as you mentioned. There are so many stakeholders within the company and large organization, and also there are so many different scenarios that can particularly happen. How do you deal with planning for a crisis and allow people to know exactly what they're supposed to do in time of crisis? Because I think that's the kind of the key issue, is that people are not totally aware what the roles are if something happens.
Yeah, just imagine the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario might be you have no operations, right? If you need to rebuild your whole network, where would you start? Who are the teams that you need to have in place? You need to start building the critical infrastructure, your DNS, Active Directories, etc. Who would do it? Who would be in that team? You need to reimage machines because perhaps your coworkers' machines, your user machines are encrypted, right? Perhaps it's a ransomware case. You need to reimage all those thousands and thousands of machines. Who will do that? You have those images available in the different places. Um, so you need to start reporting as well. You need to rebuild the network. So how do you do that? So just sit with your group, have a brainstorming session where you said, okay, everything is down. Where do we start? What has to go first and then what is second? And who is going to be leading all those tracks of work? So what can we anticipate? If we know that something will happen in the future, how do we communicate with the media or with our key stakeholders, board of directors, regulators, right, the public in general? So you can create templates and situations where you can fill out 80% of the content, right, and 20% is going to be particular to that particular incident. But that's something you can do today, and you can agree who's going to be talking to all of them. How do we report those issues every hour to our company management, every at the end of the day to the board of directors? So those are the type of things that you have to anticipate. Just imagine that you are actually in the situation and start planning on how to rebuild everything. Who will be doing it? Put a name and a last name. Create the templates, right, to show progress. If you are going to rebuild, all these thousands of laptops because they are encrypted, what is the template that you will use to show progress, to keep track of what is happening? If you have all these many locations, how many assets do you have in each location? Who is going to be in charge of that particular location? So there are so many things that you can start planning for before the actual crisis come and should be part of your incident response. Now, I remember in one of the incidents that I was part of, how do you restore massive amounts of information? So you test your backups. There is no question about it. You have offline, offsite backups. That's perfect. When you have to restore all that information, what goes first? Do you have enough restoring capabilities to deal with the situation, or is that going to be a bottleneck? Right. So all these type of questions you have to ask. I remember in a major incident when the thing happened, I had three priorities. Three priorities I defined very quickly. Number one, notify law enforcement, right? How do you notify? Do you have relationships with the FBI or some other local enforcement? So how do you notify? Make sure that you know how to do it. You will need this in case you go to litigation and also for insurance purposes, right? Number two, how do I guarantee a clean recovery? Just imagine if I am 3-4 weeks into the recovery and this thing happens again because I didn't have the precautions to prevent this in the first place, right? So how do I guarantee a clean recovery? And number three, what did happen? So a forensic analysis needs to happen. Is that going to be protected under client attorney privilege, or is that going to be public, right? So those are the three objectives that I had initially, right? So in the first few days of the incident.
And Ruben, it sounds like almost a lot of it has to do with the mechanics of the crisis. Like they're something happens and it's you have a backup, but it's not about the backup. It's about the ability to recover, which is the mechanics of it. And then a lot of it is being almost like you think that having a contact with the FBI is something trivial, but you're right. I don't know how many security professionals have contacts within the industry, depending on where they are, of course, in the US and so on. But all that has to be planned in advance. It's almost like, as you mentioned, you like examples. So when your car breaks, you should have a mechanic you can reach out to, the phone number of mechanic, and you better have the mechanic know who you are, right? Because he can call them and say, hey, these are the symptoms that I have. What do you think? Should I bring the car to the shop? But you should have that in advance, as opposed to just trying to figure out while something happens.
I like that example. You go to the mechanics, and if they don't know you, you don't know him or her, right? And looks to your car and then moves the face in a negative way, it's going to be expensive. But if you know the mechanic, it's a decent person, knows your car, knows you have a basic relationship, right? At least you know what to expect. And perhaps you're even going to have some preference, right? So you're going to be attended quickly because he or she knows you.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, you are now a senior executive at a service provider, right? And I'm assuming that you're being brought to a lot of conversations. Some of them are difficult conversations with customers because you're like kind of the de facto for CDW for security. What is that like, and what type of topics that are front and center right now with your clients? If you look at the past, 90 days, 120 days that you've been in the role, talk to me a bit about whatever you can divulge in some of these conversations. What do clients care about now? In what specific areas do you provide input for?
So basically, the customers want to get a better understanding on what is happening out there and how to protect, prevent, and also respond to those situations. Particularly, we're talking about data exfiltration, ransomware, those kind of incidents, business email compromise, those type of issues, phishing, which is basic, right, and is very, very, very old type of thing. But they are asking about it. So, what are you doing to prevent these types of things? And when they do happen, how do you go about it? They are looking for perspective, and I know they are not looking for perspective only for us as their partner and vendor. They are also looking into for perspective with consulting companies and also research companies and even technology creators, right? So those companies who create technology, they are looking for them to look for advice, but mostly it's to get perspective and the how are you approaching it, how other companies, because we have, of course, visibility into many other organizations, and we learn about all this knowledge that we have out, by attending many different customers and industries.
And Ruben, I love that. I wanted to bring up learning, and you beat me to it. How do you now keep abreast of not just current events but current technologies, because things are changing so fast, as you mentioned? And how do you share that knowledge with like industry peers? You're involved in a lot of different communities and so on. What's that process like for you? Again, because you're very busy, you're doing every day, like you're facing with customers and so on, and you're very busy, but then you have to make sure that whatever information and insight you provide is relevant, current, and accurate, right? So you have that responsibility to your clients. So how do you do that today?
So let me explain you the many different avenues that I have. So first, the very basic. So of course, the news. I try to read different news outlets. Can be TV or can be paper or internet. Second is I put some alarms as well in Google. They allow you to configure daily alarms about critical vulnerabilities, hacks, trends, whatever you want to know. So that's very basic. I also use paid threat intelligence and non-paid threat intelligence that come with some products. So I have some briefs, daily briefs on what is happening. So I am also in touch with consulting companies, our customer-facing units, um, and external parties as well. I look for advice from companies such as research companies such as Gartner, IDC, etc. And I also belong to many different CISO groups where peers we exchange information in formal settings or in a one-on-one. Somebody can give me a call, or I can give a call to somebody I trust, and then we exchange information about trends, about technologies, etc. So there are many sources. It's not only one source. There are many sources, and in those forums that I mentioned about cyber. So it's where we share additional information about, this is what is happening. We have seen this in the environment. How do you go about protecting something in this particular scenario? Even laws and regulations, right? Upcoming, depending on the type of company. So it can be international. So you want to know what is happening in China or in Russia or in India, right? And you exchange that information too.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people aspire to be you. They're coming into the space. Let's say they just finished certifications, or they've done a boot camp, and they eventually love to get on that role and become an executive responsible for security of the company. What would you recommend for these folks to do if they wanted to take that path? Because you said you work with a lot of young people, and you were like very amazed of the capabilities and so on, but it's not easy, because there's few CISOs out there, not a lot, because it is the top position in kind of the cybersecurity world. So what do you recommend for somebody who's aspired to be a CISO?
Well, the first thing that I will tell them is be careful with what you wish. it might become a reality, right? So you one day might become a CISO, and you will have all the responsibility under you, right? And in some cases, it's not pretty, right? But yeah, in reality, you have to prepare yourself. It's not only about the certifications. Certifications are good starting point. So I consider that as a baseline, right? Somebody who is committed to the profession and who is willing to continue learning. So that's the certification. But the hands-on experience, particularly in those issues such as application development, data centers, building networks, etc., know how that works. Because how can you protect or manage something that you don't even know how it works, right? So, and then once you have the opportunity, go the extra mile in whatever you are doing. You might be working in risk management or privacy, or might be working on, eyes on glass in the security operations center, or you might be doing, engineering and product implementation, etc. So there are many areas where you can start working. Go the extra mile. Don't be happy with situations where you say, well, I sent the email and I'm waiting for response. That, that doesn't work that way. In the security space, you have to grab the phone, make the call, and make sure that everybody understands what they need to do, right? So make sure that you are accountable, that you create trust and good relationships, right? But especially you know the business and you know your infrastructure. So there are many people that I know, who are protecting the house without knowing the house, right? So how do you do something like that? So I agree. You put the cameras, the fingerprinting, the biometrics, etc., in the front door, but you have a big hole in the back, right? In your backyard, you have this big hole in the window that you have not seen. So how do you know? You need to know how many windows, chimneys, doors, etc., your house might have, so you can protect them. So know
Yeah,
your environment very well.
absolutely. And if you had, and this is a question I sometimes ask, especially senior folks like yourself, where do you see this industry going in general? I mean, we keep, it's keep the industry itself is maturing or more mature, from the time you started, because again, there are more tools out there, there are thousands of vendors, and so on, but yet we still inundated with, with attacks that, as you mentioned, a couple of the top ones, the ransomware, the infiltrations, the business continuity compromise, and so on. There's a lot of these, but where is this industry going? I mean, are we losing the battle, or is it something we can potentially win? What are kind of the trends in industry? I know automation, orchestration was a trend for a while. A single pane of glass was a trend for a while. There's a lot of things that kind of moving in tandem. But from your perspective, if you had a crystal ball and looking into the future in the 12, 18 months, what other trends are you seeing?
So first of all, information security, cybersecurity is not going to disappear anytime soon. So the opposite, things will continue to happen and will continue to evolving. Now, this is a very evolving issue. So new technologies, new business needs, new threats are appearing every single day, right? And you have to cope with and maintain the pace for coping with these things. So I have seen something over time. So you remember in the 90s, there was a virus and it didn't propagate that quickly, right? So you had time to
Yep.
react.
Yep.
So new regulations was at some point the new issue, right? So I remember in 2000, what it was, 2008, I think. So the GDPR, when it came, the implementation of the GDPR was something important, something that impacted many different businesses doing business in Europe, particularly.
Mhm.
But still, we had time to react. But when situations like these days are happening, that happen very quickly in seconds, we cannot rely anymore with the guy in the security operations center that has eyes on glass all day, right? Because when he or she is looking at something and trying to make sense of that, it's too late.
Mhm. Mhm.
When we receive the email saying, you have this alert, it might be the last email that we received. So now we need to look into
Yeah.
into situations, processes, technologies, and people, right, to react in microseconds. So if something is happening, I immediately stop that something, and then I analyze what is happening, right? So I think it's one of the trends. Things are happening so quickly that we need new capability to help us protect our information assets in microseconds.
Mhm. It's so interesting. And then I also, there's, AI, artificial intelligence, is being developed, and potentially both on the defensive but also on the offensive side. And then you hear rumors about quantum computing breaking the internet, or the encryption of the internet. There's quite a few areas that are in the works right now, and I'm sure you're aware. So just kind of parting words, and I'd love to host you hopefully in the future in person in New York in the kind of one of the future events. But this has been a very enlightening conversation and much appreciated. Do you see the profession changing at all? Like becoming almost redundant? We're going to have like virtual machines that are going to, as you mentioned, become almost the gatekeepers for security, like almost AI based CISO. Somebody like a machine will make a decision in terms of what to do, or is it something that we're always going to be needing people?
Well, you know what? Machines will make the decision, but you will have to feed those decisions and those algorithms within, right? So the machine is going to be as smart as you as you feed the information into it. Anyway, I know there is artificial intelligence. I know they are learning very quickly. However, there is always a human being behind it. So I think people are going to be necessary all the time, and we do have some capabilities actually today, working in the cybersecurity space with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and those are very effective, right? I think that will continue to evolve. I see this war of artificial intelligence versus artificial intelligence because, as you said, the bad guys are using also artificial intelligence. So it's not over. I think the human being who is behind it, drafting the strategy and defining how to go about it, is essential still to this day. I think in the future as well. So a couple more remarks. Keep things simple. So I mentioned this with the analogies a little bit. So you don't have to overcomplicate things. Call things by their name, right? So there is no point on complicating things just to sound a little bit more savvy than anybody else. There is no point, right? So if you can keep it as simple as possible, you will have more friends in the business and everywhere.
What do you tell your kids that you do?
What do I tell my kids that I do?
Yeah.
So
do they ask you, "Hey, Dad, what do you do? What is it you do?"
Well, what I tell them basically is, I'm trying to prevent people from, from stealing our information or information assets, which sometimes they put the interrogation mark. But let me tell you this very interesting story. So I remember my grandmother, who, rest in peace, but back in the days, she asked me, "What are you doing for the company?" I said, "Well, I am protecting the companies," and I tried to explain, right? So I tried to protect the computers in the company and the information that we have, so the bad guys do not take that information or those computers. Next thing I know, she's talking with a neighbor, and the neighbor asked, "Oh, your grandson is here. So what is he doing for a war again?" And she said, "Oh, he's a police and he's trying to prevent people from stealing stuff in the company." I said, "Jesus, I was not good enough explaining the whole thing."
Well, she got the physical security part,
Yes,
which is
she did.
part of the domains, part of the security domain. Ruben, it's been a real pleasure. Again, thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution to the space. Much appreciated. Really fascinating story, and I can't wait to see where you go next. It's been a real pleasure having you, and looking forward to having this again sometime soon.
Thank you very much, David. Appreciate your time. A pleasure being here.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining. Looking forward to seeing you in the next session. Take care and be safe.